Alrighty, I am back. Hopefully, this has fixed the technical issue here. I'm going to check on my phone, and I'm just going to keep talking here for like another 30 seconds. By the way, I'm going to some voice lessons after this, so I'm super excited. I'm going to go meet a lady, see if we're a good fit, and see what happens there. Alrighty, and now I'm just going to do a test and then I will start the story from the beginning because I don't think it actually ever got past my name on the first one. All right, let's see here. Okay. Okay. All right, it seems like we have gotten that taken care of. Wonderful. Alrighty. So, we'll be reading Hans Christian Andersen's The Snow Queen in 7 stories. I think I'm going to read the first 3 stories today because I am going to my voice lesson after this. Without further ado, story the first, which describes a looking glass in the broken fragments. You must attend to the commencement of this story, for when we get to the end, we shall know more than we do now about a very wicked hobgoblin. He was one of the very worst, for he was a real demon. One day, when he was in a merry mood, he made a looking glass which had the power of making everything good or beautiful that was reflected in it almost shrink to nothing, while everything that was worthless and bad increased in size and worse than ever. The most lovely landscapes appeared like boiled spinach, and the people became hideous and looked as if they stood on their heads and had no bodies. Their countenances were so distorted that no one could recognize them, and even one freckle on the face appeared to spread over the whole of the nose and mouth. The demon said this was very amusing. What a good or pious thought When a good or pious thought passed through the mind of anyone, it was misrepresented in the glass, and then how the demon laughed at his cunning invention. All who went to the demon's school, for he kept a school, talked everywhere of the wonders they had seen, and declared that people now, for the first time, see what the world and mankind were really like. They carried the glass about everywhere, till at last there was not a land nor a people who had not been looked at through this distorted mirror. They wanted even to fly with it up to heaven to see the angels, but the higher they flew, the more slippery the glass became, and they could scarcely hold it, till at last it slipped from their hands, fell to the earth, and was broken into millions of pieces. But now the looking glass caused more unhappiness than ever, for some of the fragments were not so large as a grain of sand, and they flew about the world into every country. When one of these tiny atoms flew into a person's eye, it stuck there unknown to him, and from that moment he saw everything through a distorted medium, or could see only the worst side of what he looked at, for even the smallest fragment retained the same power which had belonged to the whole mirror. Some few persons even got a fragment of the looking glass in their hearts, and this was very terrible, for their hearts became cold like a lump of ice. A few of the pieces were so large they could be used as window panes. It would have been a very sad thing to look at our friends through them. Other pieces were made into spectacles. This was dreadful for those who wore them, for they could see nothing either rightly or justly. At all this the wicked demon laughed till his shy sides shook. It tickled him so to see the mischief he had done. There were still a number of these little fragments of glass floating about in the air, and now you shall hear what happened with one of them. Second story: A little boy and a little girl. In a large town full of houses and people, there is not room for everybody to have even a little garden. Therefore, they are obliged to be satisfied with a few flowers in pots. In one of these large towns lived 2 poor children who had a garden, something larger and better than a few flower pots. They were not brother and sister, but they loved each other almost as much as if they had been. Their parents lived opposite to each other in two garrets, where the roofs of neighboring houses projected out towards each other and the water pipe ran between them. In each house was a little window so that anyone could step across the gutter from one window to the other. The parents of these children each had a large wooden box in which they cultivated kitchen herbs for their own use, and a little rose bush in each box, which grew splendidly. Now, after a while, the parents decided to place these two boxes across the water pipe, so that they reached from one window to the other and looked like two banks of flowers. Sweet peas drooped over the boxes, and the rose bushes shot forth long branches, which were trained round the windows and clustered together almost like a triumphal arch of leaves and flowers. The boxes were very high, and the children knew they must not climb upon them without permission, but they were often, however, allowed to step out together and sit on their little stools under the rose bushes, or play quietly. In winter all this pleasure came to an end, for the windows were sometimes quite frozen over. But then they would warm copper pennies on the stove and hold the pennies against the frozen pane, and there would very soon be a little round hole through which they could peep, and the soft, bright eyes of the little boy and girl would beam through the hole at each window as they looked at each other. Their names were Kay and Gerda. In summer they could be together with one jump from the window, but in winter they had to go up and down the long staircase and out through the snow before they could meet. "See, there are white bees swarming," said Kay's old grandmother one day when it was snowing. "Have they a queen bee?" asked the little boy, for he knew that real bees had a queen. "To be sure they have," said the grandmother. "She is flying there where the swarm is thickest. She is the largest of them all, and never remains on the earth, but flies up to the dark clouds. Often at midnight she flies through the streets of the town and looks in the windows. Then the ice freezes on the panes into wonderful shapes that look like flowers and castles." "Yes, I have seen them," said both the children, and they knew it must be true. "Can the Snow Queen come in here?" asked the little girl. "Only let her come," said the boy. "I'll set her on the stove, and then she'll melt." Then the grandmother smoothed his hair and told him more tales. One evening, when little Kay was at home, half undressed, he climbed on a chair by the window and peeped out through the little hole. A few flakes of snow were falling. One of them, rather larger than the rest, alighted on the edge of one of the flower boxes. The snowflake grew larger and larger, till at last it became the figure of a woman, dressed in garments of white gauze which looked like millions of starry snowflakes linked together. She was fair and beautiful, but made of ice, shimmering and glittering ice, shining and glittering ice. Still she was alive, and her eyes sparkled like bright stars, but there was neither peace nor rest in their glance. She nodded towards the window and waved her hand. The little boy was frightened and sprang from the chair. At the same moment it seemed as if a large bird flew by the window. On the following day there was a clear frost, and very soon came the spring. The sun shone, the young green leaves burst forth, the swallows built their nest, windows were opened, and children sat once in the garden on the roof, high above all the other rooms. How beautiful the roses blossomed this summer! The little girl had learnt a hymn in which roses were spoken of, and she thought of their own roses. And she sang the hymn to the little boy, and he sang too. "Roses bloom and cease to be, but we shall the Christ child see." Then the little ones held each other by the hand and kissed the roses, and looked at the bright sunshine, and spoke to it as if the Christ child was there. Those were splendid summer days. How beautiful and fresh it was out among those rose bushes, which seemed as if they would never leave off blooming. One day Kay and Gerda sat looking at a book full of pictures and animals and birds, and then just as the clock in the tower struck 12, Kay said, "Oh, something has struck my heart," and soon after, "There is something in my eye." The little girl put her arm round his neck and looked into his eye, but she could see nothing. "I think it is gone," he said. But it was not gone. It was one of those bits of the looking glass, the magic mirror of which we have spoken, the ugly glass that made everything great and good appear small and ugly, while all that was wicked and bad became more visible, and every little fault could be plainly seen. Poor little Kay had also received a small grain in his heart, which very quickly turned to a lump of ice. He felt no more pain, but the glass was there still. "Why do you cry?" said he at last. "It makes you look ugly. There's nothing the matter with me now. Oh, see!" he cried suddenly, "that rose is worm eaten, and this one is quite crooked. After all they are ugly roses, just like the box in which they stand." And then he kicked the boxes with his foot and pulled the 2 roses. "Kay, what are you doing?" cried the little girl. And then when he saw how frightened she was, he tore off another rose and jumped through his own window away from little Gerda. Kay, when she afterwards brought out the picture book, he said it was only fit for babies in long clothes, and when grandmother told any stories, he would interrupt her with, "But," or when he could manage it, he would get behind her chair and put on a pair of spectacles, and imitate her very cleverly to make people laugh. By and by he began to mimic the speech and gait of persons in the street. All that was peculiar or disagreeable in a person he would imitate directly, and people said, "That boy will be very clever. He has a remarkable genius." But it was the piece of glass in his eye and the coldness in his heart that made him act like this. He would even tease little Gerda, who loved him with all her heart. His games, too, were quite different. They were not so childish. One winter's day, when it snowed, he brought out a burning glass. Then he held out the tail of his little blue coat and let the snowflakes fall upon it. "Look in this glass, Gerda," said he, and she saw how every flake of snow was magnified, and looked like a beautiful flower or a glittering star. "Is it not clever?" said Kay, "and much more interesting than looking at real flowers? There is not a single fault in it, and the snowflakes are quite perfect till they begin to melt." Soon after, Kay made his appearance, in large thick gloves, and with his sledge at his back. He called up the stairs to Gerda, "I've got to leave to go into the great square where the other boys play and ride." And away he went. In the great square, the boldest among the boys would often tie their sledges to the country people's carts, and go with them a good way. This was capital. But while they were all amusing themselves, and Kay with them, a great sledge came by. It was painted white, and in it sat someone wrapped in a rough white fur and wearing a white cap. The sledge drove twice round the square, and Kay fastened his own little sledge to it, so that when it went away, he followed with it. It went faster and faster right through the next street, and then the person who drove turned around and nodded pleasantly to Kay, just as if they were acquainted with each other. But when Kay wished to loosen his little sledge, the driver nodded again, so Kay sat still, and they drove away through the town gate. Then the snow began to fall so heavily that the little boy could not see a hand's breadth before him, but still they drove on. Then he suddenly loosened the cord so that the large sled might go on without him. But this was of no use. His little carriage held fast, and away they went like the wind. Then he called out loudly, but no one heard him. While the snow beat upon him and the sledge flew onwards, every now and then it gave a jump as if it was going over hedges and ditches. The boy was frightened and tried to say a prayer, but he could not remember anything but the multiplication table. The snowflakes became larger and larger till they appeared like great white chickens. All at once they sprang on one side, and the great sledge stopped, and the person who had driven it rose up. The fur and the cap, which were made entirely of snow, fell off, and he saw a lady, tall and white. It was the Snow Queen. "We have driven well," said she, "but why do you tremble? Here, creep into my warm fur." Then she seated him beside her in the sledge, and she wrapped the fur around him. He felt as if he were sinking into a snowdrift. "Are you still cold?" she asked, as she kissed him on the forehead. The kiss was colder than ice. It went quite through to his heart, which was already almost a lump of ice. He felt as if he were going to die, but only for a moment, and soon he seemed quite well again, and did not notice the cold around him. "My sledge! Don't forget my sledge!" was his first thought, and then he looked and saw that it was bound fast to one of the white chickens, which flew behind him with the sledge at its back. The Snow Queen kissed little Kay again, and by this time he had forgotten little Gerda, his grandmother, and all at home. "Now you must have no more kisses," she said, "or I should kiss you to death." Kay looked at her and saw that she was so beautiful. He could not imagine a more lovely and intelligent face. She did not now seem to be made of ice, as when he had seen her through his window and she had nodded to him. In his eyes she was perfect, and she did not feel at all afraid. He told her he could do mental arithmetic as far as fractions, and that he knew the number of square miles and the number of inhabitants in the country. And she always smiled, so that he thought he did not know enough yet, and she looked around the vast expanse as she flew higher and higher with him upon a black cloud, while the storm blew and howled as if it were singing old songs. They flew over woods and hills, over woods and lakes, over sea and land, and below them roared the wild wind. The wolves howled and the snow crackled. Over them flew the black screaming crows, and above all shone the moon, clear and bright. And so Kay passed through a long winter's night, and by day he slept at the feet of the Snow Queen. Thank you. I'm reading off my computer, so in between each chapter, I'm coming to check the chat. All right. Third story: The Flower Garden of the Woman Who Could Conjure. But how fared little Gerda during Kay's absence? What had become of him, no one knew, nor could anyone give the slightest information, excepting the boys, who said that he had tied his sledge to another very large one, which had driven through the street and out the town gate. Nobody knew where it went. No one knew where it went. Many tears were shed for him, and little Gerda wept bitterly for a long time. She said she knew he must be dead, that he was drowned in the river which flowed close by the school. Indeed, those long winter days were quite dreary, but at last spring came with warm sunshine. "Kay is dead and gone," said little Gerda. "I don't believe it," said the sunshine. "He is dead and gone," she said to the sparrows. "We don't believe it," they replied. And at last little Gerda began to doubt it herself. "I will put on my new red shoes," she said one morning, "those that Kay has never seen, and then I will go down to the river and ask for him." It was quite early when she kissed her old grandmother, who was still asleep. Then she put on her red shoes and went quite alone out of the town gates toward the river. "Is it true that you have taken my little playmate away from me?" she said to the river. "I will give you my red shoes if you give him back to me." And it seemed as if the waves nodded to her in a strange manner. Then she took off her red shoes, which she liked better than anything else, and threw them both in the river, but they fell near the bank, and the little waves carried them back to the land, just as if the river would not take from her what she loved best, because they could not give her back little Kay. But she thought the shoes had not been thrown out far enough. Then she crept into a boat that lay among the reeds and threw the shoes again from the farther end of the boat into the water. But it was not fastened, and her movement sent it gliding away from the land. When she saw this, she hastened to the end of the boat, but so it was before she could, I'm so sorry, I lost my place here. So it was more than a yard from the bank, drifting away faster than ever. Then little Gerda was very much frightened and began to cry, but no one heard her except the sparrows, and they could not carry her to land, but they just flew along by the shore and sang as if to comfort her. "Here we are, here we are." The boat floated with the stream. Little Gerda sat quite still with only her stockings on her feet, The red shoes floated after her, but she could not reach them because the boat kept so much in advance. The banks on each side of the river were very pretty. There were beautiful flowers, old trees, sloping fields in which cows and sheep were grazing, but not a man to be seen. Perhaps the river will carry me to little Kay, thought Gerda. And then she became more cheerful and raised her head and looked at the beautiful green banks, and so the boat sailed on for hours. At length she came to a large cherry orchard in which stood a small red house with strange red and blue windows. It also had a thatched roof, and outside were two wooden soldiers that presented arms to her as she sailed past. Gerda called out to them, for she thought they were alive, but of course they did not answer. And as the boat drifted nearer to the shore, she saw what they really were. Then Gerda called still louder, and there came a very old woman out of the house, leaning on a crutch. She wore she wore a large hat to shade her from the sun, and on it were painted all sorts of pretty flowers. "You poor little child," said the old woman, "how did you manage to come all this distance into the wide world on such a rapid rolling stream?" And then the old woman walked in the water, seized the boat with her crutch, drew it to land, and lifted Gerda out. And Gerda was glad to feel herself on dry ground, although she was rather afraid of the strange old woman. "Come and tell me who you are," said she, "and how you came here." Then Gerda told her everything, while the old woman shook her head and said, "Hem, hem." And when she had finished, Gerda asked if she had not seen little Kay, and the old woman told her he had not passed by that way, but he very likely would come. So she told Gerda not to be sorrowful, but to taste the cherries and look at the flowers. They were better than any picture book, for each of them could tell a story. Then she took Gerda by the hand and led her to the little house, and the old woman closed the door. The windows were very high, and as the panes were red, blue, and yellow, the daylight shone through them in all sorts of singular colors. On the table stood beautiful cherries, and Gerda had permission to eat as many as she would. While she was eating them, the old woman combed out her long flaxen ringlets with a golden comb, and the glossy curls hung down on each side of a little round pleasant face, which looked fresh and blooming as a rose. "I have been waiting I have long been wishing for a dear little maiden like you," said the old woman, "and now you must stay with me and see how happily we shall live together." And while she went on combing little Gerda's hair, she thought less and less about her adopted brother Kay, for the old woman could conjure, although she was not a wicked witch, she conjured only for her own amusement, and now because she wanted to keep Gerda. Therefore she went into the garden and stretched out her crutch towards all the rose trees, beautiful though they were, and they immediately sunk into the dark earth, so that no one there could tell that they had once stood. The old woman was afraid that if little Gerda saw roses, she would think of those at home, and then remember little Kay and run away. Then she took Gerda into the flower garden. How fragrant and beautiful it was! Every flower that could be thought of for every season of the year was here in full bloom. No picture book could have more beautiful colors. Gerda jumped for joy and played till the sun went down behind the tall cherry trees. Then she slept in an elegant bed with red silk pillows embroidered with colored violets, and she dreamed pleasantly as a queen on her wedding day. The next day, and for many days after, Gerda played with flowers in the warm sunshine. She knew every flower, and yet, although there were so many of them, it seemed as if one was missing. But which it was she could not tell. One day, however, as she sat looking at the old woman's hat with the painted flowers on it, she saw that one of the prettiest of them was a rose. The old woman had forgotten to take it from her hat, when she made all the roses sink into the earth. But it is difficult to keep the thoughts together in everything. One little mistake upsets all our arrangements. "What? Are there no roses here?" cried Gerda, and she ran out into the garden, examined all the beds, and searched and searched. There was not one to be found. Then she sat down and wept. Her tears fell on the place where one of the rose trees had sunk down. The warm tears moistened the earth, and the rose tree sprouted up at once, as blooming as when it had sunk. Gerda embraced it and kissed the roses, and thought of the beautiful roses at home, and with them little Kay. "Oh, how have I been detained?" said the little maiden. "I wanted to seek for little Kay. Do you know where he is?" she asked the roses. "Do you think that he is dead?" And the roses answered, "No, he is not dead. We have been in the ground where all the dead lie, but Kay is not there." "Thank you," said little Gerda, and she went to the other flowers and looked in their little cups and asked, "Do you know where little Kay is?" But each flower, as it stood in the sunshine, dreamed only of its own little fairy tale history. No one knew anything of Kay. Gerda heard many stories from the flowers. She asked them one after another about him. "And what," said the tiger lily, "hark! Do you hear the drum? Turn, turn, there are only two notes. Always turn, turn. Listen to the woman's song of mourning. Hear the cry of the priest. In her long red robe stands the Hindu widow by the funeral pile. The flames rise around her as she places herself on the dead body of her husband. But the Hindu woman is thinking of the living one in that circle, of him, her son, who had lighted those flames. Those shining eyes trouble her heart more painfully than the flames which will soon consume her body to ashes. Can the fire of the heart be extinguished in the flames of the funeral pile?" "I don't understand that at all," said little Gerda. "That is my story," said the tiger lily. What says the convolvulus? "Near yonder narrow road stands an old knight's castle. Thick ivy creeps over the old ruined walls, leaf over leaf, even to the balcony, in which stands a beautiful maiden. She bends over the balustrades, looks up on the road. No rose on the stem is fresher than she, no apple blossom, wafted by the wind, floats more lightly than she moves. Her rich silk rustles as she bends over and exclaims, 'Will he not come?'" "Is it Kay you mean?" asked Gerda. "I am only speaking of a story of my dream," replied the flower. What said the little snowdrop? "Between two trees a rope is hanging. There is a piece of board upon it. It is a swing. Two pretty little girls in dresses wet as snow, and with long green ribbons fluttering from their hats, are sitting upon it swinging. Their brother, who is taller than they are, stands in the swing. He has one arm round the rope to steady himself, and in one hand he holds a little bowl, and in the other a clay pipe. He is blowing bubbles. As the swing goes on, the bubbles fly upward, reflecting the most beautiful varying colors. The last still hangs from the bowl of the pipe and sways in the wind. On goes the swing, and then a little black dog comes running up. He is almost as light as the bubble, and he raises himself on the hind legs and wants to be taken to the swing. But it does not stop, and the dog falls. Then he barks and gets angry. The children stoop towards him, and the bubble bursts. A swinging plank, a light sparkling foam picture. That is my story. "It may be all very pretty what you are telling me," said little Gerda, "but you speak so mournfully, and you do not mention Kay at all." What do the hyacinths say? There were three beautiful sisters, fair and delicate. The dress was one of red, the second of blue, and the third pure white. Hand in hand they danced in the bright moonlight by the calm lake. But they were human beings, not fairy elves. The sweet fragrance attracted them, and they disappeared in the wood. Here the fragrance became stronger. Three coffins in which lay the three beautiful maidens, gilded from the thickest part of the forest lake. The fireflies fly lightly over them, the little floating torches. Do the dancing maidens sleep, or are they dead? The scent of the flowers say that they are corpses. The evening bell tolls their knell. "You make me quite sorrowful," says little Gerda. Your perfume is so strong, you make me think of the dead maidens. Ah, is little Kay really dead then? The roses have been in the earth, and they say no." Cling clang told the hyacinth bells. "We are not tolling for little Kay. We do not know him. We sing our song, the only one we know." Then Gerda went to the buttercups that were glistening among the bright green leaves. "Your little bright sons," said Gerda. "Tell me if where I can find my playfellow." And the buttercups sparkled gaily and looked again at Gerda. What song could the buttercups sing? It was not about Kay. The bright warm sun shone on a little court on the first warm day of spring. His bright beams rested on the white walls of the neighboring house, and close by bloomed the first yellow flower of the season, glittering like gold in the sun's warm ray. An old woman sat in her armchair as at the door, and her granddaughter, a poor and pretty servant maid, came to see her for a short visit. When she kissed her grandmother, there was gold everywhere, and the gold of the heart in that holy kiss. It was a golden morning. There was gold in the beaming sunlight, gold in the leaves of the lowly flower, and on the lips of the maiden. "There is my story," said the buttercup. "My poor old grandmother," sighed Gerda. "She is longing to see me and grieving for me as she did for little Kay. But I shall soon go home and take little Kay with me. It is no use asking the flowers. They only know their own songs and can give me no information." Then she tucked her little dress so that she might run faster, but the narcissus caught her by the leg while she was jumping over it, and looked at the tall yellow flower and said, "Perhaps you may know something." Then she stooped down quite close to the flower and listened, and what did he say? "I can see myself, I can see myself," said the narcissus. "Oh, how sweet is my perfume! Up in a little room with a bow window stands a little dancing girl, half undressed. She sometimes on one leg and sometimes on both, and looks as if she would tread the whole world under her feet. She is nothing but a delusion. She is pouring water out of a teapot on a piece of stuff which she holds in her hand. It is her bodice. Cleanliness is a good thing, she says. Her white dress hangs up on a peg. It has also been washed in the teapot and dried on the roof. She puts it on and ties a saffron-colored handkerchief around her neck, which makes the dress look whiter. She loves how see how she stretches out her legs, showing off as if she were showing off a stem. I can see myself. I can see myself." "What do I care for all that?" said Gerda. "You need not tell me such stuff." And then she ran to the other end of the garden. The door was fastened, but she pressed against the rusty latch, and it gave way. The door sprang open, and little Gerda ran out with bare feet into the wide world. She looked back 3 times, but no one seemed to be following her. At last she could run no longer, so she sat down to rest on a great stone, and when she looked round she saw that summer was over and autumn very far advanced. She had known nothing of this in the beautiful garden, where the sun shone and the flowers grew all year round. "Oh, how I have wasted my time!" said little Gerda. "It is the autumn. I must not rest any longer." And she rose up to go on, but her little feet were wounded and sore, and everything around her looked so cold and bleak. The long willow leaves were quite yellow, the dewdrops fell like water, leaf after leaf dropped from the tree. The sloe thorn alone still bore fruit, but the sloes were sour and set the teeth on edge. Oh, how dark and weary the whole world appeared! Fourth story. The Prince and the Princess. Gerda was obliged to rest again, and just opposite the place where she sat, she saw a great crow come hopping across the snow to her. He looked at her for some time, and then he wagged his head and said, "Caw, caw, good day, good day." He pronounced the words as plainly as he could, because he meant to be kind to the little girl. Then he asked her where she was going all alone in the wide world. The word alone Gerda understood very well, and she knew how much it expressed. So then she told the crow the whole story of her life and adventures, and asked if he had seen little Kay. The crow gravely and said, "Perhaps I have. It may be. No, do you think you have?" cried little Gerda, and she kissed the crow and hugged him to death with joy hugged him almost to death with joy. "Gently, gently," said the crow. "I believe I know. I think it might be little Kay, but he has certainly forgotten you by this time for the princess." "Does he live with a princess?" asked Gerda. "Yes, listen," replied the crow. "But it is so difficult to speak your language. If you understand the crow's language, then I can explain it better. Do you?" "No, I have never learnt it," said Gerda, "but my mother understands it, and used to speak it to me. I wish I had learnt it." "It does not matter," answered the crow. "I will explain as well as I can, although it will be very badly done." And he told her what he had heard. "In this kingdom where we are, all the newspapers in the world, and forgotten them too. Although she is so clever, a short time ago, as she was sitting on her throne, which people say is not such an agreeable seat as is often supposed, she began to sing a song which commences in these words: 'Why should I not be married?' "'Why not indeed?' said she, and she determined to marry if she could find a husband who knew what to say when he was spoken to, and not one who could only look grand, but for that was so tiresome. Then she assembled all her court ladies together at the beat of the drum, and when they heard her intentions, they were very much pleased. 'We are so glad to hear it,' said they. 'We were talking about it ourselves the other day.' You may believe that every word I tell you is true," said the crow, "for I have a tame sweetheart who goes freely about the palace, and she told me all this." Of course his sweetheart was a crow, for birds of a feather flocks together, and one crow always chooses another crow. Newspapers were published immediately, with a border of hearts and the initial of the princess among them. They gave notice to every young man who was handsome was free to visit the castle and speak with the princess, and those who could reply loud enough to be heard when spoken to were to make themselves quite at home at the palace, but the one who spoke best would be chosen as a husband for the princess. Yes, yes, you may believe me, it is all as true as I sit here," said the crow. "The people came in crowds. There was a great deal of crushing and running about, but no one succeeded, either on the first day or the second day. They could all speak very well when they were outside on the streets, but when they entered the palace gates and saw the guards in silver uniforms and the footmen in golden livery on the staircase, and the great halls lighted up, they became quite confused. And when they stood before the throne on which the princess sat, they could do nothing but repeat the last words she had said, and she had no particular wish to hear her own words over and over again. It was just as if they had all taken something to make them sleepy while they were in the palace, for they did not recover themselves nor speak till they got back into the street. There was quite a long line of them reaching from the town gate to the palace. I went myself to see them," said the crow. "They were hungry and thirsty, for at the palace they did not even get a glass of water. Some of the wisest had taken a few slices of bread and butter with them, but they did not share it with their neighbors. They thought if they went in to the princess looking hungry, there would be a better chance for themselves." "But Kay, tell me about little Kay," said Gerda. "Was he amongst the crowd?" "Stop a bit, we are just coming to him. It was on the third day there came marching cheerfully along to the palace a little personage, without horses or carriage, his eyes sparkling like yours. He had beautiful long hair, but his clothes were very poor." "That was Kay," said Gerda joyfully. "Oh, then I have found him," and clapped her hands. "He had a little knapsack on his back," added the crow. "No, that must have been his sledge," said Gerda, "for he went away with it." "It may have been so," said the crow. "I did not look at it very closely, but I know from my tame sweetheart that he passed through the palace gates and saw the guards in their silver uniform and the servants in their liveries of gold on the stairs, but he was not in the least embarrassed. 'It must be very tiresome to stand on the stairs,' he said. 'I prefer to go in.' The rooms were blazing with light. Counselors and ambassadors walked about with bare feet, carrying golden vessels. It was enough to make anyone feel serious. His boots creaked loudly as he walked, and yet he was not at all uneasy. "It must be Kay," said Gerda. "I know he had new boots on. I have heard them creak in grandmother's room." "They really did creak," said the Crow, yet he went boldly up to the Princess herself, who was sitting on a pearl as large as a spinning wheel, and all the ladies of the court were present with their maids, and the cavaliers with their servants, and each of the maids had another maid to wait upon her, and the cavaliers' servants had their own servants, as well as a page each. They all stood in circles round the Princess, and the nearer they stood to the door, the prouder they looked. The servants' pages, who always wore slippers, could hardly be looked at, they held themselves up so proudly by the door. "It must be quite awful," said little Gerda, "but did Kay win the Princess?" "If I had not been a crow," said he, "I would have married her myself, although I am engaged. He spoke just as well as I do when I speak the crow's language, so I heard from my tame sweetheart. He was quite free and agreeable, and said he had not come to woo the Princess, but to hear her wisdom, and he was as pleased with her as she was with him." "Oh, that certainly was Kay," said Gerda. "He was so clever, he could work mental arithmetic and fractions. Oh, will you take me to the palace?" "Oh, it is very easy to ask that," replied the Crow, "but how are we to manage it? However, I will speak to my tame sweetheart and ask for her advice, for I must tell you it will be very difficult to gain permission for a little girl like you to enter the palace." "Oh, yes, but I shall gain permission easily," said Gerda, "for when Kay hears that I am here, he will come out and fetch me in immediately." "Wait for me here by the palings," said the Crow, wagging his head as he flew away. It was late in the evening before the Crow returned. "Caw, caw," he said, "she sends you greetings, and here is a little roll which she took from the kitchen for you. There is plenty of bread there, and she thinks you must be hungry. It is not possible for you to enter the palace by the front entrance. The guards in silver uniforms and the servants in gold livery would not allow it. But do not cry, we will manage to get you in. My sweetheart knows a little back staircase that leads to the sleeping apartments, and she knows where to find the key." Then they went into the garden through the great avenue, and where the leaves were falling one after another, and they could see the light in the palace being put out in the same manner. And the Crow led little Gerda back to the door, which stood ajar. Oh, how little Gerda's heart beat with anxiety and longing! It was just as if she were going to do something wrong, yet she only wanted to know where little Kay was. It must be he, she thought, with those clear eyes and that long hair. She could fancy she saw him smiling at her as he used to do at home, and there she sat among the roses. Here we go. He would certainly be glad to see her and to hear what a long distance she had come for his sake, and to know how sorry they had been at home when he did not come back. Oh, what joy and yet fear she felt! They were now on the stairs, and in a small closet at the top a lamp was burning. In the middle of the floor stood the tame Crow, turning her head from side to side, gazing at Gerda, who curtsied as her grandmother had taught her to do. "My betrothed has spoken so very highly of you, my little lady," said the tame Crow. "Your life history, Vida, as it may be called, is very touching. If you will take the lamp, I will walk before you. We will go straight along this way, and then we shall meet no one." "It seems to me as if somebody were behind us," said Gerda, as something rushed by her like a shadow on the wall. And then horses with flying manes and thin legs, hunters, ladies, and gentlemen on horseback, glided by her like shadows on the wall. "They are only dreams," said the Crow. "They are coming to fetch the thoughts of the great people out hunting. All the better, for we shall be able to look at them in their beds more safely. I hope that when you rise to honor and favor, you will show a grateful heart." "You may be quite sure of that," said the crows from the forest. They now came into the first hall, the walls of which were hung with a rose-colored satin embroidered with artificial flowers. Here the dreams again flitted by them, but so quickly that Gerda could not distinguish the royal persons. Each hall appeared more splendid than the last. It was enough to bewilder anyone. At length they reached the bedroom. The ceiling was like a great palm tree with glass leaves of the most costly crystal, and over the center of the floor two beds, each resembling a lily, hung from a stem of gold. One in which the princess lay was white, and the other was red. In this Gerda had to seek for little Kay. She pushed one of the red leaves aside and saw a little brown neck. "Oh, that must be Kay!" She called out his name, but it was not little Kay. The prince was only like him in the neck, still he was young and pretty. Then the princess peeped out of her white lily bed and asked what the matter was. Then little Gerda wept and told her story, and that all the crows had done to help her. "You poor child," said the prince and princess. Then they praised the crows and said they were not angry for what they had done, but that it must not happen again, and this time they should be rewarded. "Would you like to have your freedom?" asked the princess, "or would you prefer to be raised to the position of court crows, with all that is left in the kitchen for yourselves?" Then both the crows bowed and begged to have a fixed appointment, for they thought of their old age, and it would be so comfortable to feel that they had provisioned for their old days, as they called it. Then the prince got out of his bed and gave it up to Gerda. He could do no more, and she lay down. She folded her little hands and thought, "How good everyone is to me, men and animals too." Then she closed her eyes and fell into a sweet sleep. All the dreams came flying back again to her, and they looked like angels. One of them drew up a little sledge, on which sat Kay and nodded to her. But this was only a dream, and vanished as soon as she awoke. The following day she was dressed from head to foot in silk and velvet, and invited to stay at the palace for a few days and enjoy herself. But she only begged for a few pair of boots and a little carriage and a horse to draw it, so that she may go into the wide world to seek for Kay, and she obtained not only boots but also a muff, and she was neatly dressed, and when she was ready to go, there at the door she found a coach made of pure gold, with the coat of arms of the prince and princess shining upon it like a star, and the coachman, footmen, and outriders all wearing golden crowns on their heads. The prince and princess helped her into the coach and wished her success. The forest crow, who was now married, accompanied her for the first 3 miles. He sat by Gerda's side, as he could not bear riding backwards. The tame crow stood in the doorway, flapping her wings. She could not go with them, because she had suffered from a headache ever since the new appointment, no doubt from eating too much. The coach was well stored with sweet cakes, and under the seat were fruit and gingerbread nuts. "Farewell, farewell!" cried the prince and princess, and little Gerda wept, and the crow wept, and then after a few miles the crow also said farewell. And this was the saddest parting. However, he flew to a tree and stood flapping his back wings as long as he could see the coach, which glittered in the bright sunshine. Alrighty, I think that'll be all that I read for this evening. Thank you guys for tuning in. I actually am heading to a voice lesson here in just a few minutes, and I don't want to wear out my voice. Thank you all for watching, and I hope you have a great night. Bye bye.